Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you with another APGov video. This is our second video taking a look at topic 5.12, the media. Now, previously we looked at the early history of the media and really looking at the early history of print media. Now, today we're going to be getting into electronic media. Now, when we talk about the emergence of electronic media, we're going to first start off talking about the impact of the radio, which first starts to go mainstream in America in the 1920s. And we're going to be seeing the emergence of the first national broadcasting companies that we are familiar with today, NBC and CBS. And what these national radio companies will do is work with local radio stations and turn them into what we call affiliates. In other words, there would be local programming for the most part, but there would also be national programming coming in from these national radio companies. Now, most of this, especially in the 20s and 30s for the most part, most of the programming on the radio stations was, some type of dramas and comedies and, occasional sports and things like that. But for the most part, not a whole lot of politics. Now, granted, you might have the occasional speech from the President of the United States. Like, for example, Roosevelt will, in kind of a genius move, use the radio effectively to promote the New Deal programs through what we call the fireside chats. But when we start getting into World War II, that's when the radio stations start to, really spend more and more time focusing in on delivering the news. And you start to see, personalities like Edward R. Murrow, for example, start to become, household names as news broadcasters via the radio. But of course, following the end of World War II, America will transition over into the world of television. And by, the 1950s, television will become mainstreamed and in many respects replace radio as the primary source of entertainment and news for the American people. And the major, the big two radio stations nationally, NBC and CBS, will transition seamlessly into television as well. And then we'll also see into the 1960s the emergence of ABC, therefore creating what we will call in the media world the big three, NBC, CBS, ABC. And kind of like how radio started a generation earlier, initially what was mostly on television was, and still is to this day, it's, entertainment programming. It's dramas, it's comedy, it's sports, it's, whatever. But we do start to see, fairly early on, the power of television as a linkage institution with the American people. And a lot of it is, centered in on the impact of this senator right here. That is Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. Now, McCarthy is going to gain tremendous popularity with his claims that there were hundreds of communists that had infiltrated the State Department. And his subsequent Senate hearings to investigate this will not just be major news, but will be broadcast on television. And so we see the popularity of McCarthy as this anti-communist warrior trying to root out, the evils of Marxism within our own governments. We're seeing that perpetuated via the media. McCarthy becomes this household name in conservative circles especially. He is seen as a hero. But the same media that built him up will also be there for his undoing. When McCarthy, begins to expand his, what we now know today is be just a blatant witch hunt, into the U.S. Army, and, he meets his match, McCarthy is going to be seen on television, shown as seemingly this cruel, belligerent man that, really had no concern about the reputations and the careers that he was destroying in this, wild goose chase in terms of trying to find communists that didn't exist, all the while to maintain his popularity. So in many respects, we look at the rise and fall of Joe McCarthy as, really being the result to some degree of the power, the emerging power of TV news. And it also, when we look at, especially the second half of McCarthy's hearings, we start to realize that McCarthy didn't have anything. It was all just bluster. It was lies and things like that. It was the media that brings that to light as well. And this is, underscoring an important role for the media, and that's to serve as the watchdog. The media, can do things that the general public really can't do. They're the ones that can, look into the actions of government. Are they doing right by the American people? Are they engaged in ethical activities? Are they engaged in criminal activities? The media serves a critical function in keeping tabs on what our elected officials are doing. Now, of course, as we get into the 1960s, the power of television is only growing, not going away. And politicians are starting to realize the power of television to not just promote policies, but to promote campaigns. We know that Eisenhower was the first presidential candidate to do TV ads, but it's really going to be the Kennedy campaign that is going to use the power of television in a profound way that we understand it today. And of course, Kennedy is going to be able to benefit from the medium of TV. He and his wife are, Hollywood beautiful, and they're young and they're charismatic, and, they're built for television. And the ability of connecting to the American people through this medium is going to prove pivotal. We know the story of Kennedy, outdoing Nixon in the debate, at least amongst those that watched it on television. And so you start to see now, like we've seen in many other iterations, the continuous evolution of a successful presidential candidate to relate to the voters. And now you have to be TV savvy. You have to have a certain look. You have to have a certain, charisma on screen. You have to be able to communicate well and look good on television to be a viable candidate for president. Now, as we, get into the, the 1980s, we see another important evolution of the media, and this is the advent of cable news. Now, prior to the 1980s, if you wanted to watch national news, it was either ABC, CBS, NBC, and they all showed the news at the exact same time, 6:30 p.m., and with very limited options. If you wanted to watch national news, you pretty much got the same national news across America. But that's going to start to change with cable news. Cable news is going to provide not just more options in terms of where you get your news, but it is going to lead to the creation of what we now call the 24-hour news cycle. And here's the importance of things. If you're doing nightly news on ABC for a half an hour a night, you don't need that much content to fill up a half an hour with the last 24 hours of available news. And so that way you can focus more on things that would be viewed as, critical and important and, things like that. But with a 24-hour news cycle, you've got to fill that time with content. You've got to find things that people want to hear about or make it something that people want to hear about. And, these cable news channels are going to start to kind of, focus in on things that may not have made the news traditionally. Things that might be more salacious, things that might be more scandalous, things that, are not necessarily going to be traditional news to some degree. And that then puts pressure on the traditional stations, their news departments, when for many of these companies that start to get bought out, like NBC, CBS, ABC, we start to see these, conglomerates that begin to own these companies starting to say, hey, we are demanding that our news departments on their own be profitable. In the past, news departments were not profitable. They lost money on the news, but that was okay because they made all sorts of other money on the entertainment. And the news departments were allowed to be true journalists. Just the facts, you know what I mean? Here's what the critical information is. Now you're going to start to see network news, along with the cable news, now focus on more of that, once again, salacious, scandalous, you know what I mean, kind of stuff that would not necessarily have qualified as news a generation earlier. And by the time we get into the 1990s, we start to see the big three of cable news. Now, CNN will be the first one to come out, and that will be in 1979. It won't be for another, almost 20 years later when Fox News comes out in 95 and MSNBC comes out in 1996 that we start to see these major cable news stations coming out. Now, these cable news stations, more so than the network news, tend to be associated with a certain ideological lean. Fox News is clearly conservative. MSNBC is clearly liberal. CNN, which had been more moderate initially, has kind of moved more to the left. We've also seen in recent years, the expansion of conservative cable news in the form of, for example, OAN and Newsmax. And when we talk about the power of these national news networks, these cable news networks, they are profound, especially for your Boomer and Gen X generations. Most Americans now get their news still via cable news. Now, that's not going to last much longer, but that is still the case today. And, folks go to these national news networks for their national news more so than their local stations. ABC, NBC, CBS, their news ratings have gone down precipitously in the last 20 years. And when it comes to local news, when we talk about local TV stations, we only tend to watch the local news if it's, for things like the weather and traffic and stuff like that. And even that is now kind of under assault because now we've got apps that can kind of give us that same information. So, the TV is still king in terms of news, but its reign is going to be coming to an end here fairly soon. And a big reason for that, well, the heir to the throne, the internet. Now, of course, with the internet becoming mainstream in the mid-1990s, we now see a whole new way to get news. It's a whole new universe, a whole new galaxy. And take a look at the impact of it. 93% of Americans now get some of their news from the internet on a regular basis. And for over a third of Americans, that's their primary source of news, especially if you're talking about people under the age of 40. And contrast that with what's happening to print media. Now only 20% and declining of people getting print news. Print news is basically dying at this point. I mean, we have seen, print newspapers go out of business left and right. Those traditional newspaper beat reporters, they have been put out on the streets. It has been, absolutely apocalyptic for those traditional newspapers. Now, some have transitioned somewhat over to the internet, but many of these newspapers, they have died out, and there's still going to be more to come. Because basically, when we talk about the rise of the internet, you're talking about the ability to disseminate news in a way that is different than anything we'd ever seen before. With television news and radio news, they're dictating the news to you with a very limited choice of options. Now, with the internet being, seemingly unlimited in terms of what's available out there, now we've got people with far more choice to determine what they want to consume as news. And it can become as niche as they want it to be. And it can be as uncredible as it could possibly be. We understand that in the world of trying to get scoops in the world of journalism, the idea being is whoever is first wins. But that's predicated on the journalism being good, on it being credible, the sources being correct, and things like that. But with the internet, you don't have these professional journalists as much as we used to. And now any kind of Jim Bob off the street can set up a website and produce news as they claim it to be news. And that, of course, creates, some shabby journalism. And not just shabby journalism, to the point of conspiracy theory on many fronts today. With lots and lots of focus on the internet, with even more salacious stories, even more stories that have been sensationalized. So one of the biggest changes that we've seen over the last 40 years is that with more diversity of news out there and the speed with which we can get the news, we have seen the competition kind of degenerate in terms of the quality of the journalism. The quality of journalism has gone down precipitously in the last 40 years. All right, we're not quite done with electronic media, but we are out of time for this episode. We'll hit social media and some other aspects of the media when we take a look at that at the next video. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.